Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on ecological drought. This webinar is the first in a 5-part webinar series that seeks to raise awareness of ecological drought, share actions that strengthen ecosystem resilience, and mitigate the impacts of drought, and highlight advancements in integrating interdisciplinary research and management needs for future drought planning and preparedness. The series is co-organized and co-hosted by NOAA's National Integrated Drought Information System, or NIDIS, and the USGS National Climate Adaptation Science Center, or National NCASC. Information shared in this series will build on the 2021 National Ecological Drought webinar series that was also co-organized by NIDIS and the National NCASC. My name is Meredith Muth. I'm a program coordinator with the NIDIS program. Joining me and welcoming you today is Jackson Valor, a biologist at the USGS National NCASC. Now, before we begin, Jackson and I will provide you with some very brief background information on NIDIS and the NCASC, and then we will begin our presentations today. NIDIS was created by congressional law in 2006 with a mandate to help the nation prepare for, mitigate, and respond to the effects of drought. NIDIS achieves that goal through the development of regional drought early warning systems, shown on the map here, whose support to improve drought predictions and forecasting, as well as support for effective drought planning and preparedness, and assessing the impacts of drought. All of our work is done in collaboration with a wide range of partners at all levels. I encourage attendees of this webinar to explore the U.S. Drought portal at drought.gov, which is the U.S. government's authoritative drought information website and includes information on ecological drought. Now I will ask Jackson Valor to share information on the NCASC and the NCASC's excellent work on ecological drought. Thank you, Jackson.
Hey everyone, as Meredith said, my name is Jackson Valor. I'm a biologist and the research coordinator for the U.S. Geological Survey National Climate Adaptation Science Center. For those who are not familiar with the Climate Adaptation Science Centers, also commonly referred to as the NCASCs consist of 1 national and 9 regional centers shown here that cover the United States, the U.S. Caribbean, and the U.S. affiliated Pacific Islands. The NCASCs bring together scientists and natural and cultural resource managers united under a common goal of helping fish, wildlife, land, water, and people adapt to a changing climate. The NCASCs use an actual science model to generate climate science and tools to help partners develop climate adaptation strategies that meet on-the-ground needs. We work directly with our partners to identify priority issues, develop research plans, and produce impactful science products. And with that, I will pass it back to you, Meredith.
Thank you, Jackson. Today's webinar is titled Ecological Drought, What We Learned and Where We Are Going. The purpose of this webinar is to introduce ecological drought as a scientific concept distinct from other definitions of drought. In particular, this webinar explores recent advances on the topic, including transformational drought, drought vulnerabilities, and understanding the future of low flows. We have 3 amazing speakers joining us today. The first is Dr. Wynne E, a biologist with the U.S. Geological Survey at the Northern Rocky Mountain Science Center. Her research focuses on wildlife disease and climate adaptation planning, and occasionally the overlap between the two. Before joining the USGS, she was a postdoc at the nonprofit Conservation Science Partners, where she conducted research on ecological drought, including the work that she will present today. Our second speaker is Dr. Shelley Crausbay. She is a climate adaptation specialist in the Office of Sustainability and Climate at the USDA Forest Service, where she focuses on drought vulnerability, tribal engagement, and climate-informed forest plan revision. And our third speaker today is Dr. Charlotte Lee, a hydrologist and Southeast NCASC Climate Adaptation Postdoc Fellow in the Future of Aquatic Flows cohort. She has an interdisciplinary background in ecological science and engineering. Charlotte is a member of the Coastal and Watershed Analytics Lab and works on changes in the freshwater and saltwater interface and impacts to aquatic species under future climate scenarios. I welcome all 3 of you today. Now, after all presentations, we will open the webinar for your questions. Throughout the webinar, all participants are muted. So if you have a question for our speakers today, please write your question in the question box in the GoToMeeting control panel. If your question is specific to one speaker, please note the name of the speaker in the question box. Now let's get started with our first speaker, Wynne Moss. Wynne, I am going to give you controls right now.
Can you all see my presentation?
Yes, we can, Wynne.
Great. Thank you. Thanks everyone for being here, and thank you to the organizers for having me. What I'm going to talk about today is the results of a science synthesis effort that focused on some of drought's more dramatic and long-term consequences. Our goal with this project was to summarize what we know and what we don't know about how droughts can lead to ecological transformation. So really, we tried to provide an overview of this phenomenon, a sort of a 1,000-foot view of what happens when drought causes these irreversible changes to ecosystems. You can read many more of the details in this paper that we just published in Bioscience this summer. And I'll mention that this was a really collaborative project involving 17 other people besides myself. So I just want to acknowledge my team of co-authors on this work. I'll start with some of the basics. As Meredith mentioned, the way that drought is defined and measured is really variable, and it depends on the context in which we're studying it. Here are just 3 of the ways that drought is commonly defined or measured. Meteorological drought is sort of our traditional definition of drought, which is an abnormally low period of precipitation, lower than average rainfall. Other folks think about drought as being a period where there's a lack of soil moisture. So that definition of drought integrates not just the rainfall coming in, but how quickly moisture is lost from soil through processes like evaporation and transpiration. People that manage water resources or that work in aquatic systems might define drought as a period where there's low water supply in our water bodies. And these droughts are often related in that a meteorological drought can lead to an agricultural or a hydrological drought, but we might have an agricultural drought without a precipitation deficit, for example. Similarly, these kinds of droughts can but don't always translate into ecological droughts, which are droughts that drive ecosystems beyond thresholds of vulnerability and cause significant ecological impacts. And just like we might want to measure the severity of a rainfall deficit using certain drought indices, we might also want to measure the severity of an ecological drought. And that measurement might include the magnitude of the ecological response and the time it takes for an ecosystem to recover. So in terms of our ecological response, it really depends on who's asking and what context, but these are the kinds of things that we might be interested in understanding. We might be thinking about productivity, we might be thinking about the abundance of certain species or taxa, we might want to know how drought affects a rate or an ecosystem process like nutrient cycling. We might be interested in survival or the structure or biomass of a forest. And then other folks might think about measuring the response of an ecosystem in terms of its community composition or the relative abundances of species that are there. So these are the kinds of responses we might be talking about. And there's a huge amount of variation in how different ecosystems might respond to the same drought event. So at sort of the lowest end, you might have drought resistance. You might just see no response of the ecosystem to a drought. And in this case, we might have a meteorological drought that just doesn't translate into an ecological drought at all. And that might be because the species that you're studying has some adaptations that let it persist even though there's a water shortage, or it might occur somewhere on the landscape that's buffered from a deficit in rainfall. So you might just see no response at all. Another option is that you do see an ecological impact, but you see a really quick recovery. In that case, we would call this high resilience to drought. And resilience can be measured on a spectrum, so you might have other components of the ecosystem or other ecosystems that take slightly longer to recover. And then at the other end of the extreme, you might also have a large impact followed by a complete lack of recovery, so no resilience at all. And that's really the option that we were interested in studying with what I'm going to talk about today. So we were interested in these really extreme examples of ecological drought in which ecosystems experience a large impact and do not recover. And we define this as a drought-driven ecological transformation. So significant changes in an ecosystem that are long-term and where drought plays a major role. And what we mean by significant and persistent change or transformation is often a change in the dominant vegetation in an ecosystem. And these are just 3 of the examples that we talk about in our paper. One is the conversion of pinyon and ponderosa pine forests to open woodlands that's happening across the southwestern US. In the southeastern US, we see that drought can often cause mortality in the dominant vegetation in salt marshes, and that can lead these systems to transform into these mud flats, which completely are devoid of vegetation. In California, shrubby, woody ecosystems, chaparral ecosystems are sometimes transforming after drought into grasslands. So what's key across all of these examples is a lack of natural recovery. So these systems are not returning to their former state, sometimes even decades after the drought has ended. The second thing that these all have in common is a large change in the species, the functions, and the services that these systems support. So when this transformation happens, we're unlikely to be managing the same ecosystem and unable to meet the same kinds of management goals. The goal with this project that I'm going to talk about today was to pull together the existing science and try to answer 3 broad questions about this phenomenon. First, where are these transformations happening and how do they happen? Second, why might the risk of transformation be increasing? And then 3, what are we going to do about it? So first, where have these transformations occurred? We investigated 12 different case studies, and these really happened all across the globe. They happened in really wet systems, and they happened in really dry systems, and it involved really diverse ecosystem types, from pine forests to grasslands to shrublands. And that tells us that the risk of this phenomenon is potentially pretty widespread, at least geographically. And in terms of how these occurred, it was really variable. It involved very different kinds of droughts. Some of these transformations happened after a drought that lasted many years. Others happened after a short and extreme drought, and others happened after a series of repeated droughts. So it wasn't necessarily the same kind of drought triggering transformation. Many of these transformations involved additional stressors besides drought, things like invasive species, fire, or disease. And many of these transformations involved feedbacks that prevented recovery. So this is a really diverse phenomenon with no one-size-fits-all formula, which means the ways that we're going to think about managing these transformations are also probably going to be pretty diverse. We also thought about why the risk of transformation might be increasing, and there's really 2 main reasons. The first is that droughts themselves are changing. Some of this is due to things like changes in global circulation patterns and human water use, but a really big reason is climate change. So we're having droughts happening under a hotter climate. And in many locations on Earth, dry periods are becoming more intense and more frequent, and that's true even in locations that are seeing higher annual precipitation. So bigger, more frequent droughts translates to more ecological impact. The second thing that's changing is ecosystems' responses to drought. So they may be seeing bigger impacts from the same types of droughts, or they might be taking longer to recover. And we can think of these 2 different drivers as separate phenomena, but both of which can lead to a heightened risk of transformation. So as an ecologist, I was really interested in why the ecological responses might be changing. And there's a number of reasons why that might be. One reason is that we are shifting the distribution of species and we're introducing novel ones. These include pests and pathogens, they include invasive species, they include grazers, and many of these biotic stressors were involved with the transformations that we looked at. And the presence of these new species interactions can cause greater stress during droughts. For example, heavy grazing during drought can lead to greater impacts in grasslands and a lower chance of recovery. And these biotic stressors, like invasives and pests, the fact that they successfully establish during droughts often decreases the likelihood of recovery of native species after drought. So they alter both those impacts and the rate of recovery in systems. We also know that drought is increasingly co-occurring with other disturbances like fire, like other extreme climate events, and drought overlaid with these other disturbances can have bigger impacts, or these other disturbances can inhibit recovery from drought. For example, fire following a drought can really destroy the chance that that ecosystem can recover. The way that we manage ecosystems in many cases has made them more sensitive to drought. For example, conducting activities that suppress fire has led to more dense forests, and those dense forests can be more sensitive to water shortages because you have many more trees competing for the same amount of water. In the Amazon, we see examples of transformation that are affected by forest fragmentation. When you fragment these forests, they're less likely to recover because there's fewer mature trees nearby to produce seed sources. So these land management legacies are also changing the ability of ecosystems to recover or withstand drought. And then finally, and this is a big one, recovery from drought is now happening under very different climates. The number of years that are suitable for a tree to germinate or survive as a seedling, those years are often getting fewer and far between, and that's lengthening the amount of time it takes for a forest to regenerate or recover. And that means that as those recovery times get longer, there's an increasing chance that they will be disrupted by the next disturbance or the next drought. So these are just 4 of the reasons why we might expect that the risk of transformation might increase even in locations that aren't seeing more severe droughts. I'll just touch very briefly on the management implications of this work through the lens of the Resist, Accept, Direct, or the RAD framework, which was designed for thinking about how we might respond to big changes like transformations. And the RAD framework says that in the face of transformation, we have 3 options. We can resist that change, we can accept that change, or we can direct that change. And resist is probably the option many of us think about first. How do we maintain ecosystems as they are? And I think if you continue to attend this webinar series, you'll hear lots of ideas for how we can resist the impacts of drought, how we can make more resilient ecosystems. But what our work says is that we might think about targeting some of these other drivers like invasive species or pests or pathogens in order to improve drought resilience, because it's very unlikely that we can control drought itself. In some cases, we might think about accepting the transformations triggered by drought. And one reason why we might do that is if drought is bringing about an ecosystem that we think is more climate adapted. For example, if drought results in the dominance of a new tree species that's more adapted to warmer temperatures and more likely to survive in the long run, we might be okay with accepting that change instead of trying to prevent that species from establishing. So in some cases, we might decide that it's not feasible to resist, or it's not even desirable to resist. And lastly, we have the option of directing change. And that's particularly true where multiple futures are possible. For example, in the California chaparral system I mentioned, those shrublands can turn into grasslands, but they could either be native dominated or non-native dominated grasslands. And in that case, we might think about, instead of trying to save chaparral shrubs that are unlikely to survive, planting native grass species after drought and really shaping the direction that that ecosystem transforms. So to be able to choose between these options, we really want to know something about what our options are, what transformation might look like ahead of time. And so there's really a need to develop a more predictive science that tells us something about the risks and the potential outcomes of transformation. That's really hard to do. We highlighted a few different types of science in our paper that we think could be really valuable for doing that. One is experiments, particularly those that span diverse ecosystems. So not just studying how different components of grasslands provide drought resilience, but actually comparing grasslands to forests to other types of ecosystems and thinking about the traits of ecosystems that make them more likely to transform. We can also turn our attention to not just what happens during drought, but what happens in the years and decades after drought. So really focusing on those recovery dynamics. One way we could do this is to return to previous droughts years after the fact and ask what communities look like many decades after droughts have occurred. And we can do that kind of thing with remote sensing data increasingly, but also just through revisiting historical drought studies. And then lastly, there's a lot of science aimed at identifying early warning signs of transformation. So being able to identify transformations right before or as they are beginning to occur. And one type of science that's being brought to the table there is just measuring the recovery time it takes for an ecosystem. And if that recovery time is getting longer and longer, and if it starts to become longer than the drought return interval, we are at risk for transformation. And the last thing I'll say is that recovery from big disturbances like drought often involves some unpredictable dynamics. and we rarely have advanced warning of when the next drought is coming and how bad it's going to be. Many of our management plans are going to have to be developed under a lot of uncertainty. And so we think awareness of this potential for transformation is really the first step so that these changes don't come as a complete surprise. So lastly, I just want to thank our funders. This project was funded by the National Climate Adaptation Science Center with support from the North Central Climate Adaptation Science Center, Conservation Science Partners, and the University of Colorado. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Wynne. That was the perfect presentation to set the stage for this entire webinar series. And now let's hear from our second speaker, Dr. Shelley Crausbay. Shelley, looks like I can see your screen. We just need it in full mode. Perfect.
Okay, great. How's that?
Yep, excellent.
Perfect. All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for having me. And big thanks to Wynne. As Meredith just said, I think she set up this talk really nicely. So I want to talk to you today about an approach we're developing to create drought vulnerability assessments. And I want to just start with our new Forest Service's Climate Adaptation Plan. In that plan, it identifies 6 key climate-related vulnerabilities that really threaten our ability to meet our mission. And Wynne talked about this a fair amount, but one of the things we really recognize is this increasing, degree of extreme events and disturbances. And for us in the Forest Service, we recognize that drought is really premier among them. And so on the right, I wanted to just show you some recent work by Jen Costanza out of the Southern Research Station. And this is showing just how much drought exposure is going to increase by mid-century. So mid-century are those yellow bars relative to the purple bars from the 90s to 2020. So this exposure is increasing, and it's increasing everywhere. All those different forest types that this is describing, those exist in the east, they exist in the west. And so we're recognizing that drought is really becoming an increasing threat to forests across the nation. And therefore, we really have a need to understand drought vulnerability better to be able to promote drought-adapted forest communities. So, I think we actually know an awful lot about drought exposure. But the question is, what do we know about drought vulnerability? So in 2017, a group of us working in a SNAP Ecological Drought project led by Sean Carter and Molly Cross and Kim Hall, we came up with a conceptual framework to describe ecological drought vulnerability, and it really borrows a lot from our thinking on climate change vulnerability. And that is, vulnerability is more than just exposure to climate change, or in this case, to these meteorological drought conditions. It's also the sensitivity a system might have, or the adaptive capacity a system might have. And those things can be depicted by landscape characteristics, ecological characteristics, human water use, natural resource management, some things that Wynne got into as well. And so these are really important to describe drought vulnerability. So now a group of us have developed a framework to create a quantitative drought vulnerability assessment. This framework we're using is flexible, it's empirical, it's place-based, and it's really very centered on vulnerability. It also leverages recent droughts as an opportunity. So there are 6 steps in this framework, and on the top of this horizontal line, you see some steps that really involve a strong science manager partnership. And then below the horizontal line, these are steps that really require scientists and modelers. So I'm going to walk through these steps with an example from Southwest Montana. So for the first 2 steps, we worked with several different agencies involved in a national drought resilience partnership project. And we determined that drought vulnerability was needed for each one of these Huckate level watersheds that I have labeled here in the upper Missouri Basin in southwestern Montana. We also determined that the drought we wanted to focus on was this drought from 2001 to 2005, an extreme and exceptional drought that lasted multiple years. So this drought is going to be the basis for the drought vulnerability assessment we create for the Missouri Basin. So in step 3, we identified forest health as the main ecological impact of concern. And we use remotely sensed data to kind of look at the trend in greenness, which is a proxy for forest health, over that 5-year-long time period of this drought in the early 2000s. In step 4, we identified a suite of potential drivers of this negative forest health. What we wanted to do was use drought indices themselves that represented different aspects of the hydrological cycle. And we got a lot of input from users that we wanted to do this because managers can really follow these drought indices in real time. So this could be a really useful component of our drought vulnerability assessment. We also identified landscape characteristics and ecological conditions that might make the system more sensitive to drought exposure. So these included things like, position on an aridity gradient. This is what I'm showing a map of here, or aspect or slope or canopy cover, vegetation type. You get the idea. There are many things that you could put in this bucket, but these are the ones that we selected for this project. So in step 5, then we wanted to run models to really ask why we saw these negative forest health impacts where we saw them. And to do this, we used a machine learning approach called boosted regression trees. And that really provides a lot of flexibility for different kinds of data sets. It allows us to visualize relationships and hopefully help managers better understand drought vulnerability. So that final step, step 6, is about visualizing this vulnerability in what we call a drought vulnerability profile. So I want to show you the drought vulnerability profiles for each of those Huc 8 level watersheds in the Missouri headwaters. All of them are shown here on the right. So first of all, I just want to walk you through these. All of the red petals are different landscape characteristics. You can think of these as individual flowers, and these lines are the petals. So the green ones represent ecological conditions, canopy cover, vegetation type, time since fire, and then the blue ones represent all the drought indices that we used in our model. The length of the petal tells you how important that variable was in terms of trying to predict where those ecological impacts would occur. So first thing you can notice maybe is that it's more than just drought indices that matter here, right? It's more than just the meteorological conditions. Second, you can see that each watershed has a somewhat unique profile. So let's just look at this top set here. These are the higher elevation watersheds in the Missouri headwaters, and we can see this flower petal representing snowpack or SWE is the most important, whereas some of these more middle elevation watersheds are showing that eddy or SPI are the most important. So thinking more about the high evaporative demand and lack of rainfall as strong drivers in those watershed locations. So let's just walk through one watershed. I've picked the Beaver Head here to better visualize drought vulnerability. So here, canopy cover, the eddy, and position on an aridity gradient were all strong drivers of where we saw impacts to forest health during that early 2000s drought. So with eddy, we can see this is the likelihood that there was a drought response on the y-axis. And then we can see the eddy values here. It's droughtier as you get more positive. This eddy really showed threshold type behavior. This might lead to adaptation actions for monitoring the best drought index for your location. As far as position on the aridity gradient, it showed us sort of where on the landscape drought impacts were more likely. And this understanding might lead managers to select where to focus their different adaptation actions. Okay, finally, that canopy cover was a really important driver. And here on the left side, I'm actually showing you not just data from the Beaver Head watershed, but from all 8 watersheds in the Missouri headwaters, because I really want to point out this pervasive and really very tight relationship between the percent of canopy cover and that likelihood of having a drought impact. And for each watershed, really, once canopy cover crossed about 70%, those ecological impacts became much more likely. So this information might lead to an adaptation action of, finding a threshold for thinning. In addition, I just want to point out that these variables are also interacting in truly significant ways, and this helps us better understand drought vulnerability. So for example, on the left, well, in both of these graphs, these bright colors show you where the drought impacts were seen. And so even though you know SPI, once you approach like a negative 1.5, you're going to get drought impacts, it's important to recognize that that's really only going to be where the canopy cover is high. We're really only going to be in these moderate positions on an aridity gradient. Likewise, vegetation type also shows strong statistical interactions with SPI. So we're learning that, you know, all vegetation types are threatened, I guess, you know, around negative 1.5, but it's really aspen and Doug fir that are the most sensitive. So our ultimate goal here with creating a drought vulnerability assessment is to ultimately use it in a participatory planning process to identify effective place-based drought adaptation strategies. So in this project, we're looking at strategies from, you know, enhancing water storage, reducing competition for water, transitioning to drought adapted forest types or spatial planning. And we did this with folks in the Missouri Basin, and we identified 13 different unique tactics that we thought were worth considering to reduce drought vulnerability really before the next drought hits. Okay, so back to the Forest Service. We're now working to try and operationalize drought adaptation with 2 pilot projects we have using this approach to develop a drought vulnerability assessment. One of them is in the Ashley National Forest in Utah, the other in El Dorado in California. And so to do this, we in the Office of Sustainability and Climate, we're partnering with the Geospatial Technology and Application Center and with Jen Costanza at the Southern Research Station. And we've already got sort of halfway through step 4 with these 2 forests. We've identified time periods that droughts were of interest. We've identified some ecological impacts that folks are concerned about. And we're even starting to pull together what we call standard data sets that are really on a national scale. This includes all the drought indices, the landscape characteristics, et cetera. And the idea is that these could be used for any forest unit. We also have unique data sets that really just make sense to the situation in which we're building the vulnerability assessment. So these pilots are going to set up the structure for making these standard data sets available, and then it will develop a workflow so that we can provide a drought vulnerability assessment for really any forest unit that wants it. And what's great about this is once we have developed these DVAs, we feed them directly into an established process we have here in the Forest Service to do adaptation planning called the Adaptation Workbook. You can see where the drought vulnerability assessment feeds in step 2. And the idea here is after this, the forest can actually take actions on the ground to make their forest less vulnerable to the next drought before it hits. Okay, and just to summarize, understanding the relationships between drought indices and ecological response is really insufficient for effective drought adaptation. We need to also consider these landscape characteristics, ecological conditions, maybe human water use that are also key components of vulnerability. And our approach for developing a drought vulnerability assessment is flexible, it's empirical, it's place-based, and importantly, it's centered on vulnerability. And finally, I just wanted to point out that drought adaptation really is a critical component of climate change adaptation. Thanks.
Thank you, Shelley. That was some excellent tangible examples of how we can better understand drought impacts on watersheds and adapt to future drought. I am now going to switch windows. Charlotte, can you see your slides?
Yes, I can. Thank you very much.
Excellent. I'll now pass it over to our third and final speaker, Dr. Charlotte Lee.
Hello, I'm so happy to be here with y'all and talk a little bit about a national synthesis project that I've been working on with a team that's looking at some links between climate change, low flows, water quality, and in-stream flow management across the United States. Next. So I just wanted to quickly acknowledge other co-authors of this project who've worked on it for the past couple of years. We come from the different CASC regions. Next. All right. So sticking with this theme that's come up in the last couple presentations on increasing extreme events. The InStream Flow Council listed that a better understanding of water quality during extreme events is a key priority for learning, and our cohort decided to focus on low flows. Climate change and increasing freshwater demand have led to longer and more extreme low flows in some regions of the United States. In this figure, you can show that this figure shows that the number of days with very low stream flow has been increasing across the West Coast, Hawaii, southern states, and in some locations along the East Coast from climate change alone. So while the Midwest and the Northeast may have changing patterns that are of precipitation in a different direction, they're still not immune to experiencing low flow extremes. Next. Climate variability, warming temperatures, and drought can impact water quality, which we know has implications for aquatic ecology as well as in-stream flow management. However, in some of these broader reviews on climate change and water quality that we have seen that are more at a global scale, there are less connections between aquatic ecology and flow management. Next. So this is the gap that we really wanted to fill with our national synthesis. So we're looking at questions like, how do low flows impact water quality in rivers and streams across specifically the whole United States? Where are those implications for water quality, or what are those implications for water quality changes in aquatic ecology? And how do flow management strategies across the United States account for both the amount and the quality of the flow in rivers? Next. The approach we've taken is a literature review where we are looking for some widely monitored flow constituents. And we're specifically looking for place-based examples in the literature of how water quality has been documented either through observations or modeling those changes in water quality during low flow conditions. And we're using we had to approach this with a holistic low flow approach. So going into this literature review, we did not constrain our definition of what a low flow was, and we noted the definitions that were coming out in the literature, as well as ecological impacts, management implications, and interactions between these constituents. Next. So the selected flow constituents that we chose were water temperature, dissolved oxygen, turbidity, salinity, and nutrients. And these are widely monitored by the US Geological Survey. And you can see that they play an important role in not only physical characteristics of aquatic habitats, but also biological and chemical processes, supporting growth and survival of aquatic organisms, as well as influencing ecological productivity through allowing light in through the water or through providing fuel. Next. So this is a preliminary summary of our reviewed literature. And so far we have reviewed 92 studies ranging from headwaters to estuaries, spanning spatial locations of single stream reaches all the way up to global reviews. So we've seen that in terms of water quality and low flow specifically, water temperature and dissolved oxygen were the flow constituents that had the most studies reporting these, whereas turbidity, salinity, and nutrients had a little less. And you can see in this figure on the right where we have plotted the centroids of studies that their distribution falls mainly on the West Coast around Texas and in the Northeast, whereas locations such as Alaska, the Pacific Islands, and the Caribbean were really underrepresented in this low flow and water quality literature. Next. So for water temperature, here in the blue box are kind of our general takeaways from all the papers we reviewed, and in the gray boxes, I'm highlighting some specific studies that support these statements. Overall, we saw an increase in water temperature during low flow conditions, primarily related to the increase in surface area for a given volume of water, allowing for more exposure from solar radiation. There were cases such as on the East Coast, where rivers and watersheds that had major dams and forests had slower temperature increases than undammed ag lands, and this is partly related to shading from riparian vegetation. There are also cases out west where higher increases in influx from groundwater reduced the increases in temperature seen during low flows. There can also be positive biochemical feedbacks related to algae blooms and sediments, which not only can create heat, but trap heat, warming these warmer waters even faster. Water impoundments. So dams and reservoirs can have mixed influence depending on how they are managed and the size of them. And one study showed that modeled reservoir releases in the summer could have the potential to reduce rising stream temperatures during low flows by 1 to 2 degrees Celsius. Next. So our temperatures are increasing, and as a result, we're also seeing dissolved oxygen decreasing during low flows. We know that warmer, stagnant waters hold less dissolved oxygen than our colder, faster flowing waters. These warmer waters also have a higher biologic and sediment oxygen demand. So we have these black water streams in coastal plains that have really rich organic sediments. And when those decompose, as well as algae decomposing following blooms, that can use up dissolved oxygen in the water column. We also see that in Hawaii, anthropogenic stream hardening has lower DO in natural channels, lower DO observed compared to natural channels. So that can also exacerbate low DO levels during low flow. And even in Alaska, during spawning, we see high densities of salmon exacerbating the already low flows during low DO during low flow conditions. And if we think about estuaries, there's also relationships where dissolved oxygen decreases as salinity increases. Next slide. So salinities, we're also seeing an increase with low flow, and there's 3 main kind of mechanisms we're seeing here. In the arid regions, especially in the west, we're seeing increased saline groundwater contributions as there's a decrease in surface runoff. And then on the East Coast, these humid, heavily vegetated regions, there's this interesting mechanism where evapotranspiration is concentrating dissolved solutes in river channels. So for example, there was an experiment looking at forested watersheds compared to urban watersheds, and the forested watersheds had an increase in salinity due to the ET from the surrounding trees, whereas the urban watershed did not get that signal. And if we think about all the way downstream in estuaries during low flow conditions, especially droughts, the marine water starts moving up channel and we see saltwater wedges moving upstream, and that can threaten freshwater intake supplies for cities, as well as it can really impact and see shifts in the biodiversity related to the salt tolerance of different organisms. So things like mine spoils and de-icers, similar to geology, they can stay in our landscapes and have legacy impacts on flow through groundwater interactions. Next. For turbidity, we're seeing mainly decreases in low flows related to decreasing velocities, which allows sediments to settle. However, there are increases in turbidity reported related to point sources, specifically thinking about upstream wetlands and lakes, like in the prairie pothole region of the Midwest, and in some of our reservoirs, like out in Nebraska, we're seeing increases in organic particles as well as algae and zooplankton coming both seasonally and during drought conditions. There's also, in general, a larger pattern that turbidity fluctuations are greater related to sediment are greater in the arid mountainous west compared to some of the flatter, more humid regions in the east. And wind over shallow waters can complicate things as it can resuspend sediments depending on channel morphology. Next. Nutrients is probably our most complex story, and it could be a whole review by itself, but the main takeaway here is we generally are seeing globally a reduction in particulate nutrients related to the reduction in surface runoff, whereas for sources that are coming from a point source because of a lack in dilution, there's generally an increase in point source concentration. However, when we're thinking about different forms of nutrients, we have particulate and we have dissolved, we're seeing mixed response from dissolved nutrients. And one of those reasons could be related to what is the limiting nutrient of a system. For example, in Oregon, during droughts, we're seeing nitrate that is more spatially variable along a stream reach compared to phosphate, which is more consistent. And one thing that's really exciting that we found in our reviews is this potential for enhanced nutrient removal processes, especially downstream of point sources in drought conditions. So this was kind of shown where comparing upstream and downstream water, these biologically active constituents had a larger decrease further downstream than their inactive constituents. Next. So linking this all together, kind of a big picture related to aquatic flows, we're thinking about seeing these increases in temperature and conductivity or salinity, as well as decreases of dissolved oxygen, can all relate to stress and mortality in different organisms, both vegetation and fish. We know that increase in nutrients can increase eutrophication. And all of these things with water quality, we're also can look at holistically with water level. A lot of approaches have looked at water level in terms of as water levels go down, we're getting decreasing habitats, we're getting more disconnectivity in habitats. So adding the water level component with water quality, we can see that there could be further impacts to food webs and migration for different species. Next. In terms of case studies for in-stream flow management, we tend to see cases where temperature and or dissolved oxygen is considered for the management of hydroelectric dams, especially related to salmon and cold water fish. Most states do not consider water quality in development of in-stream flow standards. Hawaii and Texas do, but how that is integrated and implemented, and if it's regulated, is up for question. Next. So we dove a little deeper and looked at several different flow management frameworks, and we found that overall water quality is not explicitly included in most management frameworks, but there is a large potential for its consideration. And this could be a really exciting direction in the future to expand some of these options. We did find that the functional flow framework is one that does consider water quality explicitly. And I know that is being used in California and some states out west. Next. So from our key takeaways, one of our biggest things that came out to our cohort during this project was there are some similar challenges during low flows related to water quality, and we hope that this inspires sharing knowledge across regions and scales for management solutions, and also that we can work to do a better job at understanding and monitoring and representing some of these regions, especially Alaska, Pacific Islands, and the Caribbean. Thank you very much. Next slide. I'd like to acknowledge our team of principal investigators and program facilitators and support for the Climate Adaptation Postdoctoral Fellows Program, as well as our NCs and Instream Flow Council who've been partners with us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Charlotte. This national synthesis is an incredibly valuable contribution to our understanding of low flow and its impact, so kudos to the cohort. Let me thank all of the speakers for their outstanding and informative presentations. I would now like to invite Wynne, Shelley, and Charlotte to turn on their cameras and join us for the question and answer section of the webinar. We have 10 minutes remaining, but if our speakers would indulge us for a few extra minutes, that would be great. If you have any questions for our speakers today, please enter those into the question box on your GoToWebinar. If your question is for a specific speaker, please include that name. If we do not get to your question during today's webinar, we will reach out to you after the webinar with a response. Okay, well, welcome. My first question is going to be for Wynne, related to resilience and recovery. How do you quantify resilience and recovery? What observed variables do you look at to define them?
Thanks for that question. I will say that the idea of resilience has been a little bit of a controversial idea that's been defined in so many different ways, but I think what we're mostly talking about in our paper about resilience and recovery is the time that it takes the ecosystem to return to some baseline state. So I will say that the way that we would measure that would really depend on the ecological response that we're looking at. So some folks are thinking about just forest biomass. So they're looking at how long it takes for biomass to return to its previous state. Other people might be thinking about the abundance of a particular species and how long it takes for that species to return to its pre-drought state. So it kind of depends on application. And what makes that difficult is then thinking about comparing different ecosystems. So grassland, people that study grasslands are often talking about recovery of productivity. People that study other ecosystems might be talking about recovery to the same exact species composition that was there before drought. And so it's kind of difficult then to say, is this grassland more resilient than this other system when we've measured it in totally different ways? So I don't know if that fully answers your question, but the true answer is that it can be really, really diverse in how you measure resilience, and it's sort of in the eye of the beholder and what ecosystem component you're interested in.
Thank you, Wynne. That was an excellent way to address the nuances of that issue. My next question is going to be for Shelley. In your discussion of drought vulnerability assessments, you spoke quite a bit about indicators and determining the appropriate indicators. What was the process of determining indicators for when an ecologically relevant drought was occurring? And second part, related to this, your example was from Montana. Could this be transferred to the east, especially given the significant differences in vegetation makeup?
Yeah, thanks for that question. Because it sort of gets at what we're trying to do here is make this framework flexible for any part of the world, really. So I'm not sure what you're referring to with determining the indicators for an ecologically relevant drought and when it's occurring, but I'll go back to our sort of framework that we have in BAMS that sort of showed this. Sorry, I just had shoulder surgery. I can't quite raise my hand, but it showed this flow diagram where we consider it an ecological drought if the ecological impact was strong enough that it sort of fed back into those higher levels of the system and sort of altered what ecological conditions were there before, or altered something about the landscape characteristics, or, you know, ecological impacts can even feed back and alter regional patterns in water availability or droughts in the future. So I think we want to just see that an impact was strong enough that it sort of mattered to someone who cares in that particular landscape. With regards to thinking about how some of the work we did in Montana could be transferred to vegetation types in the East, I think first of all, I want to just point you to the one slide I showed where our 6-step framework for creating a drought vulnerability assessment really relies on strong science manager partnerships. And so what I would want to do as someone who knows really very little about Eastern forests is sit down with folks who manage that area and really think about what should our indicators be, how can we work with this? I mean, we used remotely sensed data in Montana, and that approach may be very viable as well in eastern forests. I'm sure it could be. But again, I'd want to have a strong science manager partnership that would really help me think about what is the best indicator here. And I think that approach is what makes this framework we use really flexible, is it just, you have to have folks on the ground contribute to how we do the work.
Excellent. Thank you, Shelley. I'll direct the next question to Charlotte. This is related to one of your last slides was talking about in-stream flow. Does the in-stream flow framework work for impounded large rivers?
Right. To my understanding, there are many in-stream flow frameworks, and the In-Stream Flow Council has actually produced a textbook highlighting, I think there's over 20. The 5 that we selected are the 5 that are the most prevalent in the literature when we were searching. And so I think it would be really interesting. First, yes, there are different frameworks for natural streams, restored streams, as well as impounded streams. In-stream flows really focus on maintaining this idea of a natural flow regime. So low flows are just one component of it. We're thinking about, low flows and seasonally pulses of water. When are the high flows coming? What are those rates of change? So yes, it includes it, but there's very many ways that you can look at it. And so I think, sorry, I'm rambling, but the answer would generally be yes, but there's many different approaches that one could take. And so what approaches managers on the ground use is something we're interested in, and we'd have to speak more with managers themselves.
It's great, Charlotte. That was definitely not a ramble. Thank you so much. We're going to go back to Wynne right now. And this is related to detecting drought response via remote sensing. The question is, I'm curious what you see as the greatest barriers and opportunities for detecting drought response via remote sensing, and how we might monitor landscapes for subtle indicators of drought response using observations that are often temporarily or spatially coarse.
Yeah, I'll try to tackle that one with a caveat that I am not a remote sensing expert at all. I will say with our paper and what I talked about today, we're really focused on transformation. So these are pretty big impacts in the dominant vegetation. So these kind of subtleties, I don't know that they apply as well to detecting transformation. And sometimes we're talking about a change in the kind of life form from a woody species to an herbaceous system. And that can be pretty easy to detect with remote sensing, but I think what we struggle with remote sensing data is, one, there are certain types of vegetation transformations that are going to be more easily detected. So it can detect the transformation from a forest to a grassland pretty easily, but could it detect a shift in a forest from being dominated by one type of conifer to another? That kind of change is more subtle. And I think there's some advances in remote sensing using hyperspectral approaches that I'm not sure maybe can start to get at the composition in those forests. I think more importantly, if we want to know what mechanisms are inhibiting recovery, so what is driving the stability of that transformation, I do think we may be limited in what we can learn from remote sensing, and we may need to be down on the ground measuring regeneration and thinking about competition and looking at soil moisture profiles and things like that. So I think remote sensing can be a great way of saying, like, where does it look like this is happening on a broad geographic scale? And then I think zooming in can help us answer the why and how we might want to manage it.
That's great. Thank you, Wynne. I'm going to try to get us through a couple more questions. There's some good ones here. Again, if we don't get to your question, we'll reach out afterwards. This one is related to vulnerability, so I think it's going to be mostly Shelley, but anyone can respond to this. When you introduce more drought-tolerant trees into a forest system, will this also outcompete the vulnerable trees for water sources? And do you have to factor that into vulnerability when planning an intervention?
A great and interesting question. Can you repeat it again? I'm just gonna mull it over.
Yeah, sure. So if you introduce a drought-tolerant tree into a forest system, will this outcompete vulnerable trees for water sources? And if so, do you factor that vulnerability of the existing species when planning an intervention? Not quite sure how they define intervention here. Perhaps that is introducing the drought-tolerant trees. So I'll leave this open to your interpretation.
Okay, that's how I'm hearing it too. Well, it's an interesting question. So it's like you're taking an adaptation action to put in this new type of tree that's more adapted to future droughts and future climates, but you're doing it sort of maybe early in a timeline for when maybe the environment is really at that place. And so, yeah, I think if we think about things like assisted migration or, introducing more drought adapted genotypes or more drought adapted species, we have to recognize that, we have a goal, which is to make this place more adapted to future conditions. That may mean we're making a choice between what exists there today in terms of that tree species and then this other, community of more drought adapted species that we're trying to transition the system into. And so that choice is really important and obviously requires a lot of, participatory planning process to figure that out. But I think you well may see that a drought adapted species type could very well outcompete the existing not drought adapted, more vulnerable types. And like maybe if you took that action before a big drought hit, that would be interesting to see how your stakeholders felt about that. And, are you really making the right decision to, like in the RAD framework, direct the system in that particular direction at that time? But these are the choices we have on the table to make, and they're hard to make, and there are social aspects of making those choices. It's not just our ecological understandings, right? But I think there is a risk in planting more drought adapted species, but I think you're doing it because you recognize you need to move that system forward to meet the future climates.
That's great, Shelley. Yeah, this would be a fantastic discussion. Last question, and then we'll wrap this up. And I do want to flag that the next webinar series, there is a registration link in the email for those of you who have to drop off. But this is from someone from Louisiana who coordinates fish kill monitoring. And this is more related to what we're seeing in terms of kind of multi-hazards, cascading hazards, drought, flood, etc. You're seeing the impacts of extreme drought, but also changes in the timing and magnitude of other hazards, floods, extreme hurricanes, warm winters with extreme cold snaps, etc. All of this is impacting fish stocks, and I would add impacting all ecosystems. Are any of you, and this is directed to all three of you, looking at drought impacts coupled with other stressors and parsing out impacts, resiliency, etc.? Anyone want to tell?
I was just going to volunteer Wynne there, because the way when your bioscience paper sort of looks at all the different mechanisms and you really recognize that interaction, I don't know, I feel like you can answer that question.
Yeah, I think we are going to move towards a future where we're talking about disturbance like as a complex of disturbances. The part about parsing out, to me that implies like attribution, like saying this impact is due to flood versus drought. And when these things interact, they happen at the same time or they happen in sequence and one affects recovery from the other, I don't have a great idea for how you might parse out which is responsible. And I'm not sure that it's necessarily needed. So I guess I don't have a great answer to that part of the question, but I think a lot of folks are thinking about these combinations of extreme events. I think that's becoming a realization that we're not studying fire, we're studying fire followed by a drought, or we're studying a flood followed by an extreme, I don't know, wind event. Like, I think that is becoming increasingly common, but whether we can actually like then divide up the impacts among these stressors, I think becomes pretty hard.
I think that's an excellent way to end this. The next webinar in this ecological drought series is on the future of aquatic flows and will be on November 4th from 3 to 4 Eastern time. You can register for this webinar on the link that is in your GoToWebinar panel. A webinar recap along with a YouTube recording will be sent out to all that registered for this webinar, and it will also be posted on drought.gov, so feel free to share with your networks and friends. At the close of this webinar, a very brief survey will pop up. Please take a moment to answer the 5 very short questions to provide us with some feedback on this webinar series. One last thank you to all of our speakers today, Wynne, Shelley, and Charlotte. And on behalf of NIDIS and the National CASC program, thanks to all of you who decided to spend an hour of your day with us. Have a wonderful day, and we hope to see you again on November 4th for the next webinar in this Ecological Drought webinar series. Thank you.